Then we have at least María Inés talk. I'm very
It's
sorry
on.
for this. Okay.
Yeah.
Please, María Inés.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for the invitation. I am very happy to get in touch with the Center for Philosophical Studies of History at ULU, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. We have been in contact in several conferences with Johnny Matti, with Kale, with Zoltan, well, of course, Ethan. I thank everybody for paying attention to what I have to say. I am very excited. And what I wanted to, since the invitation, I was thinking what would be an interesting topic for you and for me to discuss, considering that this is a very excellent opportunity for talking and discussing. Sometimes in conferences we have only the coffee breaks, and now it's a seminar, so I am really very glad. And I have prepared maybe a little bit ambitious presentation. I already told Georg that it takes quite of the time that I have been given. So I will start by sharing a PowerPoint. You are going to see that the PowerPoint is a little bit charged with information. I'm sorry for that, but also because not everybody is a native English speaker as me, that I'm not. I wanted to have some of the sentences written so there is no problem with the accents, etc. But of course, if there is anything that is not understood, you can interrupt me, and if not, we can talk at the end of the conference. So again, very excited to be here. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint and start. Okay, can you see it? Okay, here it says that you can, wait. I'm sorry for that. Well, so I chose to name the lecture, What is Performative in History? Radical Contingency, Discourse and Embodiment. And the structure of my talk is going to be the following one. I'm going to present in a broad way the performative reading of White's insights on historical writing that I have done since my PhD thesis. Then I would like to show some connections between White's latest work, not the work he's more famous from, but the latest concerns he had, mainly in the 90s and before his passing, and connect that with the developments in contemporary feminist theory and history. I will focus specifically on John Wallich Scott's reflection on historization and identity, and Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity. This has to do with my interest of thinking the issues of philosophy of history and what we may call the inheritance from the narrativist debate in relation to this other field that we could call, in a general way, feminist theory and history, but that would include gender studies and maybe also some of queer theory. But the idea is to see some of the issues that were discussed within the specific narrativist debate in relation to other issues that came from these other fields that are connected mainly by the linguistic term or the different names by which we have named this consideration, this relevance of language to understand history, identity, etc. And finally, what I would like to propose today is a performative approach to the relationship between narratives and identity as a philosophical reflection on radical contingency. We are going to see why. And I'm going to understand this performative take as aiming to a critical shifting between the discourses that made us, the constitution of our own embodiments, and the possibilities of social change. Okay, so for the first part, I would like to talk about discourse, in this sense of performative reading of White. I have a problem with the PowerPoint. If you wait a minute, please. Sorry, I had to unshare because the PowerPoint got stuck. You give me a moment. Okay. So I would like to clarify that the performative reading I have done, or this intention to read White with some of the insights by Austin's speech act theory, doesn't mean that I want to present this as a final interpretation on what can be said about the function or the theory of language behind Hayden White's work. In fact, one of the more fruitful discussions that was produced by Hayden White's publication of Metahistory, Tropical Discourse, the content of the form was, well, what is this role, this aspect of language, of the linguistic, of discourse in our knowledge of the past in historical writing. So in that sense, I think that we have a lot of positions regarding what he was really saying, or even there are certain positions that try to read White and clarify the best way to understand language in history that we can have after his work. So in this sense, this is my bet. This is my an insight I worked on in trying to understand what Hayden White was saying with this idea of tropes, of emplotment, figures, plot structures, configuration, prefiguration, etc. So, what I wanted to analyze in the first moment is that this is something I have written about, and it's a major part also of my thesis, that there is an insistence in some of the earlier work by White on thinking historical writing in the way that Roman Jacobson thought communication as, say, this is said by White himself, a performance model of discourse. Also, and so this idea of communication and a performance model is one of the things I see as aiming to a relationship, a possible relationship to what Austin was thinking about. Also, what we have in White is a criticism of the reduction of historical writing to its referential function. This idea that what historical writing is doing is not just referring to past event in any direct or neutral form is close, in my view, to Austin's criticism of the descriptive fallacy. The idea that the only function of language, or the main function of language, is to describe reality. So we know that Austin tried to establish a distinction between the constitutive and the performative uses of language when analyzing ordinary language, ordinary speech, but also that his own position during the lectures of how to do things with words developed into considering the total speech situation, not the distinction between constitutive and performative, but the total speech situation as having three dimensions: the locutionary dimension, the illocutionary dimension, and the perlocutionary one. Again, figuration in Hayden White also has something that is close, in my view, to this view of language, because what we have in White with the idea that there is a relevant aspect of figuration in historical writing, in historical narrative, is that interpretation and information in the historical text are interrelated in a way that they have to do with the referential function of language, but in a way that it's also interrelated again with the other functions of language, and this is the language of Jacobson: expressive, conative, metalinguistic, fatigue, and most famously, poetic function of language. So which are the similarities that I think that let us see a performative way of interpreting White's work? Well, we have said that what we have in the first instance is features of language that exceed the referential function or the function of description. So this is something that has to do with several discussions. It's not that Hayden White, although there are some polemic texts or some more critical rhetoric in some of his texts, it's not that he was saying that there is no referential function whatsoever. The idea was that this referential function was also related to aspects of what the historical text is doing that exceed this only function. Another thing that is close is that both White and Austin found that there are limits to the consideration of the truth value of language. In the case of Austin, performative speech acts were not speech acts that we could say that were true or false. This is a characteristic that we could analyze in constatative speech acts, but given that performative speech acts had to do with doing something, with action, then what you have are felicity conditions, the happy or unhappy accomplishment of what the act was trying to do. So we all know the famous case of the promise. The promise is not true or false. The promise is either fulfilled or not fulfilled, but the promise itself is an action, whether it is fulfilled or not in the future. And it is the utterance of words that has to do with the act of promising, as it had to do with the example of the baptism or swearing an oath. Also, and this is what I relate with the notion of figuration and employment that I'm going to present in the following moment. Again, another aspect I found that is a similarity has to do with both of them considering in their reflection that there is no clear criteria to distinguish these features of functions of language. In a way, both White and Austin what are showing are a richness of language that has to do with leaving behind the idea that language has to do with just referring to reality or describing a state of affairs. Of course, this richness of language, in my point of view, is also what becomes problematic when dealing with the idea of historical discourse as a kind of discourse that we consider that the true or the false consideration of what is being said is the main topic under discussion. And finally, another similarity that I find in their thinking of language has to do with both of them highlighting the aspect of action in language. And because they highlight this aspect, they are also considering the relationship between language and certain conventions, certain effects of language, and in the specific wording of Austin, force of language. So we know that for Austin, performative speech acts were those in which the speaker's action, in which the speaker's action required the utterance of certain words to be performed and presuppose some conventional procedures or institutional situation to achieve their aims to be felicitous. Also, there are a consideration of the proper person being the one uttering the words, etc. So this idea of the performative, the requirement of the utterance of certain words, the notion that there are conventional procedures that are accepted or institutional situations, to me relates in my way of reading what happens with figuration and employment in historical writing. Because as we know, figuration and employment are those aspects of historical discourse that White showed that has to do with configuring or even prefiguring to produce coherence or closure as an effect of historical writing. So there is a specific phrase by White that for me is really key to understand this. He says that figure and plot structures in the historical text function as general notion the historian shares with his audience of the ways which significant human situation must obtain by virtue of his participation in the specific processes of meaning endowment of his literary cultural tradition. And this idea that figures and plot structures and the action of employment have to do with these general notions is what makes White explain how we understand the past as the action of the historian of refamiliarizing the historical record by, through language, figures, and employment, charging it with emotional balances. So in a paper that I wrote in 2014, I explained my view of how I could be reading Hayden White's take on figures and employment as a performative act. And this is my interpretation. I'm going to read it. Here we may find a plausible reading of the figurative operations in historical writing as performative in Austin's sense. By taking the literary conventions to which the historian appeals as accepted conventional procedures that contribute to the felicitous performance of historical narratives. In other words, authorized interpretation of past events. Literary conventions are, on the one hand, poetic or figurative, while at the same time being resources at hand to historians in their ordinary use of language on the other. White himself makes this performative reading plausible when stating that by sharing this convention with his audience, the historian can explain historical events by refamiliarizing them, given that, as I quoted before, he shared with his audience general notion of the ways which significant human situation must obtain, etc. The historian's claim to realistically represent the past would then be sustained in the narrative processing of historical events as a performative condition of possibility of any question regarding the truth of the facts that the historical narration establishes. Moreover, this could enable us to understand White's claim in metahistory that prefiguration is a precognitive and pre-critical act, or we can say now a performative act by which the historical field is constituted by the historian's use of language and its tropological possibilities. So what I'm highlighting is that this idea that we understand a historical narrative as explaining the past events, refamiliarizing them, making them understandable to us because of these elements of figures, of plot structure that have to do with the cultural endowment, what I'm saying is that in a way, these figures work as these accepted conventions. And also, if we think of all the effort that Hayden White made in trying to show the conventional relationship between history, writing, and narrativity, then we also have an argument to see that the confusion between historicity and narrativity, the idea that historical discourse, a discourse that is uttered from an institution, that is historical studies as an academic discipline, has the effect of the authority of explaining the past. So this is the way I see how we can understand all the issues that Hayden White presented regarding why we must pay attention to plot, employment, figures, tropes, etc., and why this has to do with understanding what else than talking about what is true or false about the past is relevant when understanding historical discourse. One of the answers that White used to give in his text of how this idea that there are aspects that cannot be evaluated by truth or false as what is relevant for them, has to do with saying that his own interest was to understand why, when there were historians that have the same degree of erudition and that have respected the rules of research in the historical record and presented different interpretation, in the end, the discussion was which was the best way to talk about the past. or saying in terms of employment figure, which was the best configuration of the past that we need before we ask the question of what is truth or what is false. So what is performative in history as discourse, as I have presented here? Well, what I'm highlighting with this idea is what has to do with the conventions of language, with the effects, and with authority. So we saw in Hayden White's work that he was interested in showing how the disciplinarization of historical studies have to do with historical discourse as a narrative becoming the sign of the authorization of the past, or as he says in one of his texts, the 0 degree of facticity. Narrativization, he shows, is the production of meaning in historical discourse through the endowment of events with coherence, plot structure, and closure effects. So, in my reading, this prefigurative nature of historical text is redefined or could be redefined as the performative constitution of past events as historical by being narratively processed by discourse. Okay, so this allows me to move to part 2. I don't know if I'm going okay, if somebody has a question for the moment, or I can move on. Okay, we are okay. Thank you. So in part 2, what I want to show is that this reading I present has to do also with me paying attention to some of the concerns that I see are coming back or being analyzed in different ways in White's latest topics. This is what I call a move from discourse, although discourse is always going to be a concern, to the figurative self-making, the issue of self-making as figurative in the topics of Future Realism, medieval writing, and the practical past. I'm just going to show some of the issues because I cannot present everything, but of course I'm open to questions after the end of the talk. So this idea of figurative self-making shows the interest to link discourse and agency, something that we already saw in metahistory in the content of the form, because Hayden White is very worried about showing the action, the options, the choices, the moral aspect of writing history. But in the latest topics, what I think is that Hayden White was worried about thinking ways for a community to retrospectively appropriate the past for its own project of self-making. So how do communities constitute this link between past, present, and future? And in my view, as in White's thought and in the question he asked, as a critical shifting, a movement between discourse and agency. And I consider this critical in two senses. In one sense, I mean ironic, self-critical, self-conscious, born from the realization that language is more than a simple medium for conveying a message. This is the well-known demand of White to the historical profession to be linguistic self-conscious, but also I mean critical in the sense of difficult, slippery, in a both positive and problematic sense. And I think that White has always focused on what we can do with language, specifically narration as an artifact that unites discourse with history and vice versa. But at the same time, this realization has been a critical recognition of our limits and constraints in doing so. So for example, in Future Realism, Hayden White says the following. I'm just presenting a broad perspective on this topic. He says, a given historical event can be viewed as the fulfillment of an earlier and apparently utterly unconnected event when agents responsible of the occurrence of the later event link it genealogically to the earlier one. This linkage is established from the point in time experience as present to the past, not from the past to the present as in genetic relationships. And it is an aesthetic one because it places the principal weight of meaning on the act of retrospective appropriation of an earlier event by the treatment of it as a figure of a later one. It is not a matter of actuality. The facts of the earlier event remain the same even after appropriation. What has changed is the relationship that agents of a later time establish with the earlier event as an element in their own past, a past on the basis of which a specific present is defined, end of quote. He says also that historical events are not then caused by earlier ones, nor determined by them, and nor are they predictable on any grounds of teleology as realization of earlier potentialities. But as with a rhetorical figure, the later fulfills the earlier by repeating the elements thereof with a difference. As historical, says White, an event remains open to retrospective appropriation by any later group that may choose it as a legitimating prototype and an element of its genealogy. And in this reflection of Future Realism that has to do also with Auerbach mimesis, etc., he also says that this idea of Future Realism has to do with historical writing being a promise of realistically representing reality that is impossible to fulfill, and in that sense, a performance. When we see White's worries about middle-word writing, then we find another kind of issue that has to do with agency and subjectivity in writing, and also a clear reference to Austin's idea of the performative. White says that another way of thinking the relationship between the subject of writing and his writing was presented by Roland Barthes when he sees the modern notion of writing as middle voice, where writing is not a mere activity like an active voice or passivity like in the passive voice, but a modality of action in which the subject affects itself regardless of an object being involved in the action or not. The subject constitutes itself contemporaneously to his writings. An action, says Barthes, and is reconstructing also Hayden White, where the subject, the I, is interior to the action, not exterior to it. A mode of writing where there is no subject as a psychological entity or an author previously given to the writing. And this is a quote from one of White's texts. I think that this is writing in the middle voice in Fiction of the Narrative. He says, I'm quoting, for Barthes, writing in the middle voice is creative and liberating insofar as it places the writer agent within the writing process and reveals the constitution of the subject of writing as the latent principle, aim, and purpose of all writing. Indeed, for Barthes, writing in the middle voice is a perfect example of the kind of speech act that J.L. Austin called performative. For just as much as promising or swearing an oath or judging have the force both of the active and of the middle voice, inasmuch as in doing them, one not only acts on the word, but also changes one's own relationship to it. So too, modernist writing both acts on something, language above all, and transforms the writing subject's relationship to the world. Finally, again, I'm just presenting broad thoughts of these topics. The issue of the practical past, one of the latest issues and the latest book he published while he was alive, White started thinking about this distinction by Michael Oakeshott, and in a way, in a pessimistic tone, I think he was proposing to get rid of the historical past and turn attention to the practical past instead, and he, following Oakeshott, considered the historical past as the scientific study of the past, as an end in itself, and for its own sake, a past that teaches no lessons of present interest, built by historians that only exist in books and academic essays. Again, this is clearly a pessimistic tone regarding his long desire for the historical profession to assume a relationship of action, of choice, of moral self-awareness regarding the writing of the past, given that if the past is an end in itself and it teaches no lesson, then there is no involvement of historical writing with present action. And then the practical past would be an alternative in the sense that has to do with the notion of the past that people hold in everyday life, to which they appeal at will or not for ideas that can help with practical problems in present situations, in anything from personal matters to grand political programs. And he says that it has to do also with problem solving and creating tactics and strategies for negotiating personal and collective life. So this is my performative reading, and I think that I have shown you're going to tell me if you agree, that there is this particular worry about subjectivity, agency, discourse as making communities appropriation a past as a legitimating prototype. But I have wondered critically in relationship to White's latest preoccupation with the practical past, if there aren't cases of a practical past that we could also consider a historical past, so to avoid this dichotomy of being historical or practical. And I would mean, in this sense, a historical writing that it is a historical writing, but deals with some form of critical self-making. This is something I had published in the paper I mentioned below. And this allows me to move to the third part of my presentation, that is the case of feminist history and theory. Here I'm going to appeal to some reflection by Scott and Butler. So we all know that John Scott famously has worked on how the notion of historization, the critical perspective on identity. So, and of course, she has been one of the major critics of conventional historiography's foundationalism. So this is a quote for one of her more recent, in a way, books, The Fantasy of Feminist History from 2011. And I'm quoting because she explains this perfectly as her own position. I quote, "For a while, I have been writing critically about identity, insisting that identities don't pre-exist their strategical political invocations, that categories of identity we take for granted are rooted in our physical bodies, gender and race, or our cultural, ethnic, religious heritages, are in fact retrospectively linked to those roots. They don't follow predictably or naturally from them. There is an illusory sameness established by referring to a category of person, women, workers, African American, homosexuals, as if it never changed, as if not the category, but only its historical circumstances varied over time." End of the quote. And in this sense, there is an interesting discussion that I have been working on in some papers and some unpublished ones that I hope will be published soon. There is an interesting discussion of Scott within the field of women/feminist history. Is the history that is being written from this point of view a history that has to do with women or with a feminist perspective? And Scott says the following, that is the part of the quote I mentioned earlier, and again, it is clear, that's why I'm quoting again. "Thus, women historians, to take the example I know best, have asked how changes in the legal, social, economic, and medical status of women affected their possibilities for emancipation or equality. But they have asked less often how these changes alter the meaning, socially articulated, subjectively understood, of the term women itself. Few feminist historians, Dennis Riley is the exception here, have heeded the advice of Michel Foucault to historicize the categories that the present takes to be self-evident realities. Even though for Foucault, the history of the present served a clear political end, denaturalizing the categories on which contemporary structures of power rested, and so destabilizing those structures of power, those who resist his teaching have taken historicization to be synonymous with depoliticization. This synonymity is only true, however, if historical rootness is seen as a prerequisite of the stability of the subject of feminism, if the existence of feminism is made to depend on some inherent, timeless agency of women." This final aspect of the discussion, whether there is or there is not a stable subject of feminism, has been one of the major discussions in gender studies, feminist theory, for the past at least 4 or 5 decades. And Scott clearly is in a self-conscious post-structuralist position that believes that the distinction between male and female, the notion of woman and man, a notion that we never have to take for granted, and to see how in different contexts, historically and geographically, this distinction is being enforced or is being trace, or define. So this relates to another famous critique of Scott. I have presented recently her conclusion, her final or definite position on how we should think about identity in historical writing and not assume or take for granted even those categories of identity that we consider rooted in our physical, in physical reference or as the descriptions of who we are. But this also relates to the famous critique of experience that Scott presented in her article, The Evidence of Experience in 1991, where, as I have shown recently, there is this debate within women or feminist history and what status to give to the notion of women or woman. There is a similar discussion that Scott has with the appearance of histories of difference, or also called oppositional histories, where Scott, on the one hand, admits that the appearance of this kind of histories of difference meant an important challenge to conventional historiography because they provided new evidence for a world of alternative values and practices, the very existence of which questioned the hegemonic construction of social worlds, such as the political superiority of white men, the coherence and unity of self, the naturalness of heterosexual monogamy, etc. Histories of difference relate famously to women, feminist history, but also LGTB history. But there is a critique, although she is in favor of this kind of critical intervention to the discipline, and this new historical point of view from writing, but she considered that this strategy has been a limited one, insofar she considers that histories of difference remain within the foundationalist framework of historical writing when the subjects, this other subject, marginal subject that claim to have a history, to be subjects of history as well, use the notion of experience as the evidence for their histories. So she criticized the use of experience as, again, a foundational notion. Experience, says Scott, does not happen outside established meanings. Thus, historians should, again, historize identity categories as well, instead of taking them as the point of departure of experience, because identities from the post-structuralist and mainly Foucauldian framework that Scott is appealing to are considered as products, as effects, and not as causes. In there you have a famous quote from this article, says Scott, subjects are constituted discursively, experience is a linguistic event, it doesn't happen outside established meaning, but neither it is confined to a fixed order of meanings. Since discourse is by definition shared, experience is collective as well as individual, experience is a subject history, language is the site of history's enactment, historical explanation cannot thereof separate the two. End of quote. Well, this is the point of radical contingency that I wanted to present in the talk. And in a way, maybe I should say that is the point where I'm philosophically convinced by the criticism that Foucault, Scott, and Butler had presented of our idea of identity, and also especially about history as we have understood it. So we all know that there is a very polemic claim by Foucault in Nietzsche, genealogy and history, that is the following one: nothing in man, not even his body, is sufficiently disabled to serve as the basis of self-recognition or for understanding other men, end of quote. So what was the point of this text by Foucault that inaugurated his very idea of genealogy following Nietzsche on his own terms? Well, the point was to discredit and to be against metaphysical history. And instead of the aim of the text is not just to destroy this notion of history as metaphysical, but also to, in a way, I would say, refigure the notion of history as a radical contingency. So this takes us to what I want to present about Judith Butler's notion of performativity. Again, I'm not going to present the whole theory. Of course, we can discuss this later, but I want to show some aspects that for me relate to the critic of identity that is key in the notion of performativity by Butler, the relation that this has to do with the notion of historicity as radical contingency and with the authorized narrations that we found around identities in our social world, and again, the aspect of the performative that now has to do also with norms, power, practices, conventions, normative repetition, but also has to do with what is productive of subjectivity, what is generative of identity, instead of being a description. So Butler's famous text from the 1990s, that was Gender Trouble, was explicitly a genealogical critique of gender. It aimed to show the historicity of the sex-gender distinction as a radical contingency. Before Butler's work, the notion of sex and gender as a fundamental distinction for women's history or feminist history had to do with assigning to gender the character of an analytical category that would be necessary to trace how the distinction between feminine and masculine is presented in different contexts, aiming at the symbolism, the sexual division of labor, the gender identity lived as an individual identity, and also how language functions with gender as a primary way of assigning roles, of legitimizing certain things, even though things that have nothing to do with women and men. But in that working of the gender category as a fruitful analytical category, and in this sense, Scott's work from the 80s was fundamental, and she is considered one of the theologians of the category of gender. This category of gender assigned to sex the aspect of what was a perception of the difference of bodies, or was natural or rooted in biology. So the critical genealogy of gender that Butler presents is a genealogy that shows how, by leaving sex as a prediscursive element in the reflection of the distinction between sex and gender, while assigning to gender the productivity of being historical, constructive, contingent, and thus changeable, this what produced was a reification of the notion of sex that leave a lot of questions and issues out of reflection and historized. So why am I talking about this? Because this is what happens with this notion of gender performativity. Butler criticizes gender as a given or substantive identity, but for doing this, she has to critically examine, to do exactly the genealogy of the structuralist narrative of the incest taboo and the prior taboo against homosexuality that that are found in Levi-Strauss anthropology and Freud and Lacan's psychoanalysis that were used to explain the immersion of culture, of language, and of sexual difference. And by doing that analysis, that critical reflection, Butler showed how those authoritative narratives, rather than being descriptions of gender, function as generative moments of gender identity, the prohibitions that produce identity along the culturally intelligible grids of an idealized and compulsory heterosexuality. To say it in simpler terms, what Foucault did with sexuality in the history of sexuality, the first volume, where he shows how sexuality is a very concrete historical figure, but sex is an ideal element that is presented as the cause of the dispositive of sexuality, is what Butler is doing with the heterosexual matrix and the distinction considered as natural between male and female. The distinction of sex as binary, as dichotomic, has to do with the production of the heterosexual matrix and not the cause. It's not the cause that there are male and female ways of being bodies, but it's the heterosexual matrix that establishes that as an effect in which we believe and that we feel obliged to repeat and to conform to. Thus, Butler recast the notion of gender as performative as a doing, not an identity that is the cause of the expression of our gender behavior or characteristic, but as a doing, a social ritual drama, a normative repetition. And how is that done? How does she recast gender as performative? By critically decoding the inherited narratives that have produced the very notion of gender identity as their reality effect. So another thing that I want to point out before moving on is that the effort, then we can have, and there has been a lot of discussion on this, as the discussion on the role of language in historical writing for white. We also have the discussion on how this has to do. Thanks, Georg, for letting me know about the time. In Butler's, the problem is, what is she saying? Is this a form of cultural determinism? Is it that we can take out our gender from one day to the other and become another? Well, this very interesting and famous discussion also was part of the movement that Butler wants to do for getting out of the binary trap of determinism and free will. And so she says that this idea that performativity in relation to gender identity is a reiterative and citational practice by which discourses produces the effect that it names. This is the specific way, one of the ways to announce how Butler understands performativity in this sense. This has to do with understanding that because the supposed foundation of gender are contingent ones, they have a temporal nature, then this opens the normative framework of identity to the possibility of its displacement. To move a little bit further, I would just quote this final sentence. Paradoxically, says Butler, the reconceptualization of identity as an effect that is as produced or generated opens up possibilities of agency that are insidiously foreclosed by positions that take identity categories as foundational and fixed. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm having again the problem with the PowerPoint. Give me just a minute. Sorry for that. So I have a little bit more to present. I think I'm going to take the whole hour. Georg, thanks for, well, I don't know why the PowerPoint is not working again. Let me see. Okay, so till this moment, this passing through these developments by Scott and Butler in contemporary theory and history, feminist theory and history, have bring us to this moment of interpreting that identity is an effect and history is radical contingency. We can see that the take by Butler on gender and identity coincide with Scott's position regarding experience and language. Of course, they are both post-structural thinkers, but I think that this also has to do with White's position on meaning endowment with plot structures and figures in the sense of understanding these possibilities of meaning that are limited, that are authorized, and we found them as taken for granted, but that this doesn't mean that there is not room for agency. In my view, figural resources, the tropological possibilities of discourse, are the instrument for negotiating the narratives of our identity as these reality effects. So this moves me to the final part of my presentation, that is trying to present a view of what we have been talking about narratives and identity in this way of crossing the discussion from narrativism and Hayden White to the discussion that had been done in the realm of feminist history and theory, and present a kind of philosophical reflection that assumes this idea of radical contingency, history, and a connection with the notion of embodiment as follows. So what we saw is that both the narrative take by Helen White and feminist theories show us the relationship of which have been the conventions and the norms, and which has been a certain challenge of feminist history to historical writing and historical and theory as well. And I think that this has to do with this kind of conventions that we saw that the historian shares of how human situation must obtain, in the sense that feminist LGTB history have shown that these notions, this notion of significant human situations, have been assumed in the discipline as some of them as significant, but the only relevant ones when, by the critique of histories of difference, feminism, etc., we have seen the androcentric, the sexist, and the heterosexist biases and the exclusion of difference, that some of those situations that were considered the more significant one to understand what was a historical process, a historical subject, had been. So this is something that has been already acknowledged and incorporated to some extent, I think, in theory of history and history writing. In a way, and this is my idea, that there are some historical paths that are related to the practical past, we have seen social change affecting some theoretical change. And here I think that one notion that could be interesting by Hayden White is the notion of discourse that he presents in Anthropology, Discourse, and Modes of Human Consciousness, the introduction of topics of discourse. Here, I'm going to read, Hayden White says the following about discourse in the humanities. He says that discourses regarding topics as human nature, society, culture, and history always deal critically with pre-encoded experiences, other previous discourses, and that this has to do with the nature of discourse as always trying to establish its own authority in the face of prevailing discourses on the topic under discussion. He sees here discourse as a movement, a discurrere, that aims, which aim would be to deconstruct a conceptualization of a given area of experience, which has become hardened into hypostasis that blocks fresh perception or denies, in the interest of formalization, what our will or emotion tell us ought not to be the case in any given department of life. And at the same time, it aims at marking out an area of experience for subsequent analysis, thus moving between receiving causation experience and the clutter of phenomena which refuses incorporation into conventionalized notions of reality, truth, or possibility. It also moves between alternative ways of encoding reality, some of which may be, says White, provided by the tradition of discourse prevailing in a given domain of inquiry, and others of which may be the ideology of the author, the authority of which he's seeking to establish. I'm going to move this to move forward because the quotation was showing this idea of the deconstruction and recodification of authorized narrative. So my question is there a relationship between social change and historical and historiographical change? Well, we saw with White that 19th century historiography, in his view, meant the success of meaning production in historical discourse by a narrativizing reality effect, while historical discourse was pretending to be letting events speak for themselves. Now, discourse in the humanities says in this text I have quoted, is used to facing previous, what we call referential illusion or reality effects, in a way, meaning that the standard point of writing has to do with those narratives that are already written, accepted, circulating as authorized interpretation of the past. It may not necessarily be this way, so this is not something that applies to any case of historical writing, but those interpretations can be received as a naturalization to which, in the present context, or depending on the drive that animates the writing of the past, there can be a certain resistance. So how can we relate this notion of identity, contingency, and critical self-making, this last aspect being an aspect that I take from Hayden White? Scott was referring to this when she was talking about the illusory sameness established by referring to a category of person as if it never changed. Critical self-making, then, I believe, will not be a pure invention of a community's history and identity, but a critical relationship with those categories and narratives that have come to define it or represent an hegemonic way of defining it. Identity as an effect, if we understand identity as an effect, we understand it as a contingent effect, a temporal one, not necessary nor definitive. It can undergo a process of refiguration, this movement that puts into question the very authority of previous historical narratives that may imply also denaturalization or disidentification, as we saw with the perspective by Scott and Butler. So what is the issue of embodiment here? For Scott, historical writing that assumes history as radical contingency should historicize even the categories of identity we consider rooted in our physical bodies. So our way of understanding our bodies, our own embodiment, should also be historicized. Feminist theory, as I said, has shown that not only gender figures as a precondition for the production of and maintenance of legible humanity, says Butler, but sex itself, this is a quote by Scott, sex itself had to be historicized as the product of social and cultural discourse. The claim is not that our embodiment is constructed as if culture was a subject doing the action of constructing it. This will be a form of cultural determinism, and not Scott, not Butler, not me are trying to say this. Nor does the contingent nature of identity and its narration equal voluntarism or absolute free choice. Our embodiment is intertwined with the discourses and practices that inform and inform the identities by which we come to understand ourselves as subjects. And insofar as identities are both contingent and social, it is, I claim, in the possibility of collective social change that the authority of the discourses that present them as given can be contested another way to understand the possibilities of bodies emerge. So a philosophy of history that relates to embodiment and social change will consider historical writing as through a performative take on discourse and embodiment, paying attention to the way that women, feminists, LGBTQ+, and other social movement related standpoints have already challenged conventional historiography's authority by showing its assumptions, exclusions, and biases. In this way, it could be redefined as the possibility of a critical shifting between the discourses that made us, conventional historical narrative, authorized version of the past, these reality effects, and the constitution of our own embodiment as that which authorized discourses produce while presenting the same as descriptions, and the possibilities of social change. Those movements that seek different, in most cases better, life conditions, including the end of violence over their bodies, and demand the transformation of the constraints that the received narrative of their identities impose on them, conceptualization of their embodiment that have come to block perception or deny what not to be the case in their lives. So to end this presentation, my question is now, so what is performative in history? Well, my take is that we are. And when I say that we are performative, what I meant is that what is relevant for me in the discussion is the changing notion of what it means to be human as an embodied experience of radical contingency enabled and constrained by the discourses and practices that have established who counts as a historical subject on one hand, and on the other, by the social changes that denaturalize them, submitting their authority to criticism and allowing the refiguration of the way which significant human situations can obtain. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Maria Inés, for your talk. It was very interesting. Is there any, now it's time for discussion, obviously. Is there any immediate questions, comments, queries?
Do you see the hands? There are. They're clapping. Okay.
They're clapping. Yes. I mean,
yeah.
you can raise your hand or write something in the chat that you have a question. Well, Gil, was that a question? You raised your hand.
I have a question.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Maria, for your interesting talk. I have several questions, but I start with one. And one is the term reality effect. It pops up several times in your discussion, but I'm not sure I understand it properly. Because as I understand it, Barth means by reality effect that when you present a literary work, you need to invoke certain details, because these details provide this sense of reality. So that's a technique that you have to use as a novelist. But historians, they don't need reality effects, because the reality is already there. But apparently, I either misunderstood Barth, or I'm completely at loss of what you mean by this reality effect. So could you perhaps expand on it and its importance for your argument?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I was in doubt whether to include or not the notion of reality effect, and so I decided to do it in the sense of highlighting the idea of our notion of reality as an effect. Of course, it doesn't mean that it is an invention in the sense of a pure invention. It has to do with the series of figures and conventions that are already circulating in our cultural endowment that allow us to understand something as a realist narrative. I think that in my reading of Roland Barthes, and I'm here, these are two texts that are involved. One is the Discourse of History, and the other is the one where specifically the notion of reality effect is developed. I think that and you know that there is an interesting similarity between Roland Barthes' take on the Discourse of History and Hayden White's notion, although in metahistory he didn't read that at the moment of publication of the book. The idea for me is that what Roland Barthes is saying in a more critical way, writing from a point of criticism, has to do with understanding how historical discourse or narrative discourse presents itself as an objective way of discourse instead of a subjective way or a literary way. And in that sense, the Discourse of History is quite critical of that. He also says that it's a kind of schizophrenic discourse because it pretends that nobody's talking. So I think that with the notion of reality effect, although technically you are right, it has to do with the kind of techniques that you use to recreate a reality. Well, some of that is what Hayden Whitehead is talking about historical writing. The historical record doesn't come with all those details. This is an aspect that the historian offers that creates in the sense of producing the image of the past as a coherent and complete process. And in that sense, this is another idea by Roland Barthes that relates to this, is that the very idea of the completeness of the past as a necessary aspect of understanding the past for us. And this, I think, is a cultural critique of how we understand history, that we cannot understand it if it's not in a way that the past is complete, as Hayden White says in The Value of Narrativity, over and done with, but without disappearing. So I think that the use of the notion of reality effect for me is to highlight the idea that there is a productive, a generative, a performative aspect of historical writing with the referential function. The problem and the polemic aspect to accept, if we are not interested in this problematic as leaving it as that problem, is that then how can we discern what is the part that can be or not true, and what is the part that configures and prefigures and produces the coherence or the configuration needed for the questions about the past. So I don't know if you are satisfied with my answer, but I will say that.
Okay. Any dissatisfaction can be raised in a further question, if there's one, and later, preferably if there's now. Is there anybody else who has a question immediately? Still, Matti, yes?
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting, very rich talk. And I have mainly some questions about clarification from you, or maybe one of the authors you were citing. And I start with one quite from the early stage of your lecture regarding performativity. And it made me thinking, because you started with Hayden White, obviously, and that the sort of performativity takes place in the middle of a sort of, it relies on the configuration, something, what is it, tropes or structures that is shared with the audience or the culture or something like that. So that's a sort of, if I understand, sort of Whitean conception. But then if you consider performativity, there's also an individual historian, or if a historian writes a book, it could be a performative act by this specific individual. And now this springs mind sort of Quentin Skinner, who is, of course, Austinian in a way. So when someone writes a book, it's as if an performative action, his personal action to say something, to argue for something or against something, and so on. So it's a kind of specific product, performative product, maybe argumentative product of this particular historian. Okay, and this is my question. So how would you locate this idea of performativity between this cultural structure, frame, and the individual? Is it that an individual always locates this specific action in this frame, or to put it in other ways, what's the relation between sort of individual and the sort of collective? Yeah, that's my
okay.
question.
Well, great question. I need another hour to answer the question, but I'll do my best to do it in a few minutes. I think that there is a History and Theory published an article by Martin J. that is called The Missing Counter Between Hayden White and Quentin Skinner. I have been meaning to write something about that because it also ends with something said by Quentin Skinner and Hayden White. And I think that Hayden there said something about him being a post-Freudian. I remember, but just to mention that there is something to work on and to analyze on that. I think that the question that you ask is a very important one and a very different one to answer, because this let me move a little bit in a broader scope than Hayden White's work or historical writing in that sense, but the kind of relationship I'm trying to establish between the performative in Austin and in a perspective more related to Foucault's genealogy on biopolitics and performativity in the sense of Butler. The direct attack is if in Austin and in White, the issue was to show that there is a fallacy in considering that the only function of language is to describe reality. In the case of these post-structuralist thinkers I am working with, the fallacy is the individual. So the whole discussion has to do with showing that the notion of the modern notion of the individual is not the point of departure of humanity. And in this sense, this has to do with showing this notion of discourse production, matrix of intelligibility, etc. So putting a major emphasis on the idea of what you have said, cultural framework. But on the other hand, they don't want to present cultural framework or dispositive of matrix as something that gets rid completely with the idea of the individual. The idea is to be how this aspect have a certain co-constitution, because those cultural frameworks in this position, because history is radical contingency, are contingent ones in two senses of being contingent. In the temporal sense that they could be different, that they are a sedimentation of effects in history that could have gone another way, but there is also an assumption, a specific stress in them not being closed systems. In that sense, I didn't present it because it was too much or too long for a lecture, but there is a relationship between Butler's notion of performativity with iteration in Derrida that has to do with effects that are open in their actions that are open in their effects. So there is not a system that makes no room for the individual, but which that room is, and the notion is agency here, is what is trying to be recast without claiming that the individual is a substantive identity that is completely, that is the point of departure of thinking, of writing, of acting, of having a gender, etc. So this will be one part of my answer. And the other has to do with the idea of the individual historian or the argument. I think that there is no problem with analyzing an individual production or argument. I think that the issue in Hayden White's work and in relation to what I have been saying about feminist theory and history has to do with all those aspects that are out of the control of the individual, in the sense that constitute the individual as such. Nobody is an individual, and that's it. That is the criticism on the idea of scientific discourses as neutral. There is a position, somebody is speaking from some position, scientific knowledge, historical writing has to do with the production of a community, and so there are assumptions shared, there are ways of seeing the world that are shared, that are previous to the individual. This does not mean that the individual can have an input, an invention. In fact, I think that on the side of Hayden White, there is a claim that there is an individuality that the historian can claim, but that it has to do with acknowledging the choices. So the aspect of the aesthetic, the ethic aspects of the historical text that are choices, that are not given, not pretending just to be showing how the past was. I don't know if my answer is appropriate for you, or would you like to ask me something back?
Well,
yes, good answer. I mean, I can ask something further or add something about you, Georg, or is there some other?
Well, is there anybody else who wants to say something? I mean, I would have a question too, but I'm the moderator, but I'll let you have the word if you want to continue.
Yeah, yeah, so that's, I'm just continuing this sort of conversation in a way that imagining, because I'm still imagining, trying to figure out how much an act of an individual is constrained by the shared, whatever that shared is. And how I think of Skinner is quite an individualist, I think, in his reading of Machiavelli, and you know why it was written for. So it's sort of how much there's room, I guess the piece, how much there's room for an individual's volition or intention to produce something. And just another thing that springs to mind is if you start explaining a specific written act as take it as a book, then you know how much this is a product of the structures or the content. And I think there might be an interesting bedfellow to White. Then this is a totally strange suggestion perhaps, but the sociology of knowledge, social scientific knowledge, which puts a lot of emphasis on the sort of the context or the social context specifically. And it's a bit of an open question whether someone produced a scientific belief or even a book just because of the, you know, just because of the factors in the context. But this is just continuing this thought. That's not really more than that.
No, it's interesting. Well, I think a lot of things come to my mind, but I think that one of the issues that comes to my mind is the notion of context, in the sense that one of the in the case of White, you have this movement between invention and discovery. founding and creating this idea that I remember, I think that is in the historical text as a literary artifact, that he's clearly stressing the idea that tropes that guide the kind of relationship that are established by language between historical objects or in the objects in the historical field. Those relations are both discover and find. So, and this has to do with because idea of the trope, no? So in the case of Helen White, I think that I would think that the room for individuality is stronger there, and also because in the end, and this has been something very much stressed for me, more clearly stressed by a beautiful text by Hans Kellner that is the bedrock of linguistic humanism. Helen White has an issue of showing the decision, the option, the existentialist aspect of a choice. I think that in this sense, then there is more room. But in the other kind of theories that I'm trying to think with, I think that choice has to be refigured. It cannot be an individual choice because there is nothing that is an individual. There is layers of identity and ways of understanding the subject that doesn't mean there is like separate individual from the context. But the context is not saturated. The context is open in its effects as a reproduction of ways of thinking what is human. To say it in another terms and to end with an example, one of the major things of paying attention to women and feminist history is to show how the assumption of male as the typical subject of history was an assumption. It wasn't a deliberate will of oppressing women and leaving them outside of historical text. Given that there was history written by male, there was an assumption of gender that wasn't questioned. So in that sense, the notion of the individual as somebody that can present something anew is not, in my opinion, discredit, but what anew means is a more complex thing. That will be my answer, but it's an excellent topic to speak for hours.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
We have another question now, so maybe we can move on for the moment. Ethan?
Sure. Although, you know, one thing that makes me a bit nervous is when we get into the structure agency binary, there's a way in which we get into an old and seemingly intractable argument, and something that might be some yeast to leaven it is to think about, you know, other ways of thinking about actants, actor network theory, to move into the scientific structures, that there are other constellations that would allow it to not be one or the other, but some sort of more complex system. But actually, I wanted to talk about a different binary that came up in your talk, and that's the question you ask as to whether there can be a practical past that is also a historical past, whether you can sort of bring those two together. And the example that you do give is feminist history, but instantiated through Scott and using Butler. But at least as so far as I understand it in the presentation, and probably in White's work as well, the history that he's so pessimistic about is this sort of, you know, academic history with all its guardrails and restrictions, and the freedom or liberation that he sees as the practical past, which is the past that non-historians, anyone, takes up for themselves and makes it their own. And, you know, I've always secretly thought there was some sort of, you know, Heideggerian aspect to that in White that he didn't want to make explicit between a kind of the history, which is that academic or an authentic understanding of the past, and Geschicklichkeit, or the historicality, which would be the way we take up the past on our own and move with it. And of course, it can be done in authentic or inauthentic ways. But so the example you give us is academic history. And even if you know, I love Joan Scott, but her books and the way that they're operating, I don't think are quite, at least not yet, operating in the way of taking up the practical past, at least as articulated by White in his work. Maybe Butler more so. I think maybe that one. But I wonder whether you could guide us a little further into the way the kind of histories you're imagining actually take up and engage the practical past. Is it, to follow Unimati's question, is it really for the historian who's writing it that does so, or is it actually going to lead others to find their meaning, to take up their past? How, to your mind, does this work and get activated?
Okay, thank you again. It will be a very long answer because you make me think, and I thank you for that. Just a comment. In the historical event, White takes some of the Heideggerian vocabulary, and so he says he was trying to present some ideas by Heidegger, but it is true that there aren't other texts by Heidegger where he tries to be Heideggerian. And also in that very text is almost all the time on the footnotes. So there is maybe there something of what you are sensing. In relationship, well, I think that my answer to what you are saying is, I don't think I'm trying to say to historians what they should do, in the sense that this is not a prescriptive approach to historical writing. I think that instead I'm worried about something that was one of White's major worries, and also Scott in another way, that was the social function of history. And in that sense, I think that the interest in trying to see how certain historical writing or disciplinary writing or scientific disciplines or academic disciplines can be related to taking the practical past is, for me, the understanding that knowledge and power are related, and that what is said in a place where society founds some kind of authority over reality, although I think that authority is also in a decline in our contemporary society, I think that something of that is of relevance. And I want to give you an example of what I mean. In the context of gender studies or historical writing, the notion of patriarchy was developed, but also mainly in the 90s was discredited as a kind of colonizing gesture that trying to understand the universal oppression of women as the patriarchal, etc., etc. Well, there is already in the 70s a very interesting discussion with Gail Rubin with the notion of not every oppressive society for women is a patriarchy, etc. But for example, in the contemporary feminist movement that has re-emerged mainly in South America and that has spread around the world. I say mainly in Latin America because the beginning of the feminist movement, you have the Me Too movement around 2017, 2018, as the emergence or re-emergence of feminism, but in Argentina and Latin America, it already started in 2015. And here, one of the things that is brought to critical discussions on how our society works and why are women and LGBTQ plus people targeted and oppressed and subjected to a violence has to do with talking about patriarchy. So what I'm trying to show with this example is that our political discussions in the social open public discussions on a moment of renegotiation of the limits of our sexist or heterosexist society. And in 2020, Argentina was the first country in Latin America to approve legal abortion. This renegotiation of the norms of sex and gender in our society appeals to notions that are notions from the academy, from the production of knowledge. So what I'm saying with all this is that my interest in mapping a way that we can connect the practical past with the historical is that there is of necessity a possible of a link there, for better or for worse. So academy is signaled as a kind of outside discourse that through biology, medicine, sociology, and other fields has reinforced inequality or oppression. And on the other hand, when there is a political movement, there is an appeal to concepts. Gender is not a political concept that was born from the streets. It's a concept that was translated from psychiatry and sociology to gender studies and to feminist history. And today there is talk of gender all over the world. And then you have another very interesting phenomenon that I'm also tracing. And with this, I finish my answer. That is that you effectively have an international discussion. Of course, to pay and to do a proper research, we have to go by country and seeing the differences in context, but you have a discussion of gender ideology. We have discussions that have to do with legal frameworks in different countries over if there is or if there is not a gender ideology that is destructive of the way we understand society, and this is a public discussion on gender ideology. That is a way of conservative and right-wing groups to backlash against the legal and human rights advances that have been around the world on LGBTQ people and women, etc. So what I'm saying with all this is that these things are in a way enmeshed, for the better or for the worst. So for me, an aim of thinking of the practical past is to say these things matter in everyday life. It's not just an issue within experts or historians, or at least that is not. Another thing I don't know what to say is that I have a whole picture of how historiography works or should work. But this is an aspect, and if there is something that for me is an opportunity for thinking the practical for all, because the practical could also be a misuse of the past. It doesn't have to be a good use of the past. And so there are, for me, the philosophical questions. I don't know if I answer properly, Ethan. Yeah, thank you.
If nobody minds, I would like to interject myself now. I mean, I'm the moderator, so I still should be leaving other people the floor, but I think what I would like to ask fits very well after Ethan's question, maybe. So if nobody minds, I will go now shortly, because I would be interested for the effects of what you said, sort of on the opposite, on what White called the historical past. Because you just said you're not prescriptive either, which is interesting. But I wonder, identity, the notion of identity, you referred to Joanne Scott and her work on that. And then you said we have to see identity as an effect. But what difference does that make to the work of the historians who works on identity or identity issues? I mean, okay, identity has been very unhealthily, historiography has been very unhealthily connected to nationalism in the 19th century and to certain political ideologies, often enough, we do know that. But a historian approaches, I think, the past via sort of its traces, the evidence, or whatever, what there's left behind about the past. And in that sense, whether his identity is an effect or not, is maybe not a concern for the historian. It's more like identity is reproduced by people. It's a category that applies to people, to agency. It wouldn't exist otherwise. So in that sense, identity is identity, whether it existed or not, in the minds of the people of the past, it's an empirical question, right? So maybe if I rephrase it, I don't understand what conceptualizing identity as an effect how would conceptualizing identity as an effect make any difference to the work of the historian? I mean, I understand it against nationalist, fascist, or whatever sort of ideologies which would presuppose a fixed identity. And we all know this is wrong, but for the work of a historian who properly employs what I call the historical method, they just know that it's historically constituted, and therefore by the traces of how people thought about themselves in identitarian ways, they will find out, or they should find out. Do I miss something here or does, yes, maybe that's the question.
I think that there are several questions, but they are all very interesting. So I'll try to answer. And if I don't answer everything, you can ask me back. First, I would answer specifically like clarifying Scott's position, in the sense that Scott's position in historiography as a practice is a post-structuralist position. And her post-structuralist position, well, we have to see some changes or development that Scott has worked on by introducing psychoanalysis also to the issue, but I know I need another talk. Whenever you would like to invite me, I'll do it. But what I want to signal is that the notion that subjects are discursively constituted and that identity is an effect means for Scott that first, identity is a historical event. So the event of the appearance of an identity, the emergence of an identity in her Foucauldian perspective is what historians should go and analyze first. Second, same names are not same identities. Woman, even if it is the same word, is not the same identity necessarily in the past. So this is, I'm like unfolding Scott's position. Scott's position, I would say, has a prescriptive side because it has to do with if we do not have a metaphysical approach to history, if we understand history as a radical contingency, even the identities we would seek to study in the past have to be studied as an event, as a historical and discursive event. So that would be one part of my answer, and I wanted to say something else, and I forgot it. Well, so then you have a prescriptive and typical linguistic term consequence in Scott's perspective, that is that you should not take same words as same entities in the past. See, so there, I mean, and there I mean Scott. I'm talking as if I were Scott. So that would be the answer. There is a very important change in the way you conceptualize what you are going to do with the historical records. And another, one example, for example, is the discussion over when did homosexuality, the homosexual as such, emerge. In Foucault's work, in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, a homosexual is an identity that was, that emerged in a relationship with psychiatrical, psychological, medical, institutional, juridical discourses at the end of the 19th century. So it's not the same to be a homosexual as a species, says Foucault, given the framework of the dispositive of sexuality, than to engage in kind of sexual relationship that we now consider homosexual. So that would be the prescriptive or the interested for a historian. And in that way, it's a typical post-linguistic stance that has to do with not assuming that language is in your writing or in the sources describing something. Is performing, is creating, is generating, and then you have to distrust the idea that same words have to do with the same. And this is very challenging because we have an idea. I don't have it because I have undergone a subjective transformation through gender studies and feminism. But we have the idea that since there is a human species, there are male and female. And so then you see how the relationship between male and female have been around the history of the world. And well, maybe not. Maybe male and female is a way of describing that is producing how we understand bodies. And you can have today the intersexual community and the trans community claiming that there is an imposition of a specific order of whose bodies counts as normal bodies or human bodies, in that idea that you go to the past and see what male and female have been doing around the world. So that will be one part of my answer. You change your position towards the language you find and the language they use and your relationship with your own categories when you see identity as effects. The other thing that I would say is that it also has to do, and here I go back to Hayden White, with your own identity as a historian as an effect, in the sense that historians are not transhistorical subjects. They are very specifically historical subjects that emerged in a certain moment where there was a discipline that trained certain experts in a certain way to see the past in a certain way and to see that the past is something to study and blah, blah, blah. So one of the most polemic claims by White was that the historians were very prone to historicizing everything but their own discipline, but seeing their own discipline as historical, even as historical in the sense that in some moment it's going to stop being a discipline. It may go away. So that is interesting also. And identity as effect has also to do with how you consider that being a historian is the same. Is really every historian doing the same thing? Is there a method? I will discuss that. But I mean, it has already been discussed. There is a method of history. But that doesn't mean that you can, of course, argue that there is one that is the proper one. Although history is quite a difficult discipline to have one method when there is so many different ways of doing history, which is the common aspect. One of Hayden White's more polemic claim was that in the end, what you are all doing is narrativizing something in the past to present it as a historical object. But well, that will be, again, these are fabulous questions, so I have a lot of things, but I want to stop to give time for you to ask me again or for somebody else to ask.
No, thank you very much. That was very illuminating. Is there anybody else who would have a question now? Was that a hand, Giel? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about, well, you said, well, historians forgot to historicize themselves, but perhaps the post-structuralists too forgot to historicize themselves. Because if I take this idea that subjects are discursively created, but perhaps subjects are only discursively created in the sense as proposed by Scott and Foucault in modernity, in a specific historical condition. Perhaps subjects are not created discursively in, let's say, 5th century Athens or 3rd century Rome, and because this idea of subjects being created discursively has to do with the functioning of the state and functioning of knowledge in a typical society. So this claim that historians should historicize themselves, well, perhaps the post-structuralists should also historicize themselves. I'm not sure if that's what you think about that.
It's a great question, and I have two answers. I think that they historize themselves because post-structuralists are always, I mean, I don't want to talk about post-structuralists. I will talk about the examples I work with, Scott and Butler, and that have also worked together a lot. So they really share things. And also Scott criticized her own position on gender through Butler's position. So I would talk about these two key figures of post-structuralism in history and gender studies and feminist history. I think that they historize themselves in the sense that the idea that the idea that subjects are constituted by discourses and practices is not a universal idea. It's an idea of the kind of subjectivity that you can grasp, quotation marks, when you do not have a metaphysical approach to reality, the past, identity, etc. So there is a position, there is a non-metaphysical approach, and then how do subjects emerge? Then, and this has to do with not only the truth and power regime of modernity, but with the contemporary moment as a moment that inherits the mourning in the sense of recognizing that the death of a certain kind of subjectivity, the death of a certain kind of idea of humanity. That would be like defending them. But on the other side, I would say that there is the question that I think you are asking, and or that also you prompt to my mind is post-structuralism something of the past? And I think that is a very good question, in academia or as a philosophical position. And to that I think that is an excellent question, I will say that there are some moves in the work of Scott and the work of Butler that, although they keep on saying they are post-structuralist, and in that sense, they are not going to resign the idea embraced of the immersion of a subject from discourses and practice and historical and temporal and contingent and etc. They are trying to analyze something that goes to other positions. For example, in the case of Judith Butler, the political writing that she has been doing from the 2001 moves some aspect of post-structuralism out of the discussion. For example, Nietzsche goes away. The language of power and the will to power is not longer there in Butler's work, but for me it has to do with the political and ethical engagement that she's establishing, where she prefers the notion of norms instead of the notion of power. And she's trying to make an ethical argument for political transformation. And in that sense, I think that you can see it in the change from reference to Nietzsche and Foucault, the genealogical Foucault, to the reference of Levinas, and the Foucault of the stylistic of the self and the critical relationship to norms. So there's something of the more strong, polemic, denouncing aspect of post-structuralism per se that I think that is going away. And in the case of Scott, I think Scott is the one that remains more post-structuralist in that sense, but she's also trying to redefine the way we understand causality by introducing some ideas of psychoanalysis and fantasy, etc. And there's also something a little bit different. So it's a good idea, it's a good question to see what of post-structuralist discussions is from the past. But for me, it's still present in my own way of thinking. It doesn't mean that it has to stop here, but there are things that to round up, and this was part of my abstract when I wrote my proposal for the talk, there are aspects of Hayden White and there are aspects of this post-structuralist reflection that I don't think we should abandon. I think that one of the things that happens in our discussions in history and theory is that, that we are trying to move forward and present other concepts, and I think that is great. And we should do everything to think anew and make this a lively field. But that doesn't mean denouncing the past, in my case. I think that there are tools that have been gained. And I think that one of those tools clearly has to do with a critical perspective on how discourses, narratives, identities circulate, are enforced, and are reproduced within and outside academia. And this is a moment where that is clear for me. So I don't want to renounce that as a philosopher. I don't know if historians in their practice, maybe as George is Georg, sorry, is claiming that there is a method and he wants to go that way. Well, he will go the way he wants because it is his practice and his way of understanding his own identity as a historian. But for me as a philosopher, there is a gain that I don't want to renounce. So I am not stuck in the past, I think, but there are things that are worthy, and that in that sense, given that Kalle Pihlainen is in the audience, I think that Kalle has a point in his book on the work of history when he says there have been sterile discussions over narrativism that should be left behind. So nobody was saying that everything is fiction and that there is no distinction between history but the distinction is a political one, or is a figurative one, or is a critical one. And in that sense, I think that moving forward should be what we are all wanting to do, but that doesn't mean forgetting the tools we have gained. And that would be my position on that.
Okay, thank you very much. You said I'm not stuck in the past. It's great. But the question is also, what claim on the future do we still have? Should we still make? We are nearly 2 hours into which is great, into our talk now. So I would suggest if anybody has still a question, one more we can take. There's, I saw Joni Matti. Of course he can speak, but if there's somebody else who hasn't spoken yet, obviously, or then they can speak first. Otherwise, I'll give the last opportunity to ask Joni Matti before we close. Yes, I think you can.
Right, thank you. This is a very brief question. Maybe the answer will be brief as well. I don't know, depends. Just I was struck by I think it's a Joan Scott's idea of experience being linguistic. And while reading this against, let's say, the mainstream philosophical tradition, in particular empiricism, but also other traditions, rationalism, even empiricism, experience is nothing but linguistic. If something is non-linguistic, it's experience. Of course, the concept of experience can be, the term at least can be linguistic somehow. And I was just curious, and of course there are big debates about whether, even though there is experience, anything can be determined or fixed in terms of meaning, even the color concepts, by reference to them or not. There are big debates. This is my first question. I'm curious, what is meant by that idea? And I ask another, and this is even briefer, metaphysical history. What is it? Does it mean realism about historical knowledge? That is, does it mean that the idea that there is a fixed form of a past or specific knowledge of the past, which also can be known? Or what is metaphysical history?
Okay. Well, those questions do not have a brief answer, but metaphysical history, let me start by the second one, is the critique. It is clearly presented in Foucault's text of Nietzsche, Hierarchy and History, and is the idea of putting the idea of order in some sense into what history is, the order of a continuity, the order of a teleology, the idea of solemn and truthful origin that explains what unfolds after that. So that is the critique of history. I think that I teach that text in my philosophy of history course in the philosophy department in UBA. And every time I teach it, I see something new, because it's not an easy text to teach, but you can see that what Foucault is doing is generating another concept of history that is not a concept that presents an order of grounds or foundations or something that is transhistorical. If history is something, is the impossibility of transhistory, in the sense of something that becomes permanent over time. And in that sense, I agree. I mean, at least I agree with the criticism. I also, of course, another aspect is that metaphysical history would hide from sight the dispute over the interpretation of the past, because the past is one way, so then there is one interpretation of the past. And for Foucault, history is the history of the ones that dominates and the ones that are dominated, and how this unfolds over time and how this change over time. So that would be metaphysical history, and has to do specifically with Nietzsche's criticism of 19th century historians, and the whole idea also of creating the identity of the European. He says in the text something like, the European does not know who he is, so he invents genealogy of purity and race and etc. So that's for the second part. Regarding the first part, well, you experience is said in many ways. So to answer if experience is or not linguistic, in the case of Scott, of the article, it's not that experience is linguistic, it's that it doesn't happen outside of meaning. So, and I think this is something that relates to a topic that, for example, in Anker Smith's Sublime Historical Experience, you may find going to the notion of experience as something that has to do with something that is before or a priori or independent of language. Well, you have to argue that that position, and I think that you don't need Hayden White, you only need Thomas Kuhn and Quine and Goodman and Rorty to struck empiricist dogmas and their assumptions, and to talk about the theory-laden, the idea that the data and phenomena are theory-laden. I think that the problem is not to, again, trying to think out of binaries. Experience is not linguistic, experience is completely linguistic. Well, the real issue is that this is not a clear distinction. What is part of my experience of being a woman, of having this body, and what is part of the definition of woman by which I was raised? Judith Butler's idea of performativity is that at the moment that you are born, and with the technology that you have today is before, is with the ultrasound even, or today even with the diagnosis that you can do of embryos by genetics, there is a performative decision on how to name your body. And so when you're born, it's a girl, it's a boy, and that's the only options you have. And so my experience of this embodiment has to do with the experience of this embodiment that is mine, that is private, that is authentic, or does it have to do with the ways I am named by the medical discourse, by the social discourse, by political discourse? And in that sense, again, you have groups that have been pathologized for their boys not being quite boys, quite girls, like the intersex community, that are striving for laws that recognize that they are in a normal variation of embodiment, and they are not part of the binary way of interpreting bodies as they come to the world. And then, so is that experience an experience that happens outside of or not of language? So I think that when you see it from the point of view of feminist theory, gender studies, sexuality studies, experiences are normative design in society for you to fix into an order. And is that good or bad? It is. Could it be better? Well, some of the activism has to do with opening, and this is Butler's point in gender theory, opening categories when they affect experiences because they don't allow for some aspect of the way of life or the way of bodies to be equal in society. And we are not talking just about categories. We're talking about violence, because intersex babies were subjected to very painful surgeries to be accommodated to the ideas of male and female in society. So, I mean, I'm sorry that I take you to all the other side, but again, in that framework, in this kind of fields of reflections, that experience is not something without meaning, is something that is productive of other ways of thinking lives of people, social regulations, laws, and a certain more just world. But again, I don't know, it's a very important discussion and we could go. I'm sorry for the not short answer.
Thank you.
Well, that was great, yes. Also this answer. Well, I think we have come to the end of this event now. Now it's time for me to thank all of you and to thank especially María Inés for her talk. And as I just said before, we will stay on a little bit now. So those who want to, please stay with us and have a chat. Thank you. you can stop the recording, Yoni-Matti. Thanks.
Thank you very much.